All right, little arm skill. Oh, nice adjustment by the wide receiver on that one. Ooh, nice. There's a toss, baby. Jalen Hyatt. That was a great connection. Nice catch. Woo-wee. Like that one. There's the Jared Goffian-like skills. Who knows, man? Who knows? The Lions are clearly very happy with Jared Goff. We are coming off of the mega extension, just signed a $212 million 4-year extension for Jared Goff. That's a $53 million annual average value, putting him in the elite tier of quarterback contracts. There weren't many losers to this entire situation, but there may have been one, and that is the Lions' backup quarterback. Thank you guys so much for returning for another video. I am your host, Johnny Gaz. Today, we're going to continue our player profile series. We're going to profile Lions backup quarterback, Hendon Hooker. We're going to look at his history. We're going to talk about his current situation, now tied in with the Jared Goff contract, and see what the future holds at quarterback for the organization. Let's go. Before we give it the old hook, make sure to hit that like button on the video if you're digging the vibe here at Johnny Gaz Sports. Make sure to hit the subscription button and notify bell so you don't miss any future videos on the channel. We are working on a membership option and exclusive content. If you'd like to become a part of the channel, make sure to reach out. I appreciate you guys so much for being a part of these videos. All the comments, the likes, all the interaction lately has been fantastic. I cannot tell you how much I love talking Lions football with you guys. Thank you so much for your time. Let's get into today's topic. So as we do with all of our player profiles, let's take it back. Allen Hendon Hooker was born January 13th, 1998. He is 26 years old entering the 2024 season, standing at 6'3" and just under 220 pounds. He grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, and attended James B. Dudley High School. He comes from a family of athletes. His father, Allen, is enshrined in the North Carolina A&T Hall of Fame. I believe his brother played quarterback there as well. His mother also was a prized athlete. So from a very young age, he was extremely athletic. He was All-State 2 times over. He also won the state championship at Dudley High School 2 times. In 2016, he was named the championship MVP. His statistics in 2016 as a high school senior are just completely ridiculous. If you have a moment, definitely go look them up or check them out on the screen here. Hendon Hooker was also a very successful basketball player at Dudley High School, scoring over 1,000 points over his career. Ultimately, he left the school as a 4-star athlete recruit and a 3-star quarterback. The recruiting history and transfer trail for Hendon Hooker is very interesting. I spent a lot of time researching this topic. I actually almost put out this video just before the Jared Goff contract was signed. Obviously, that took precedence, and we spent a lot of time discussing that impact over the Lions. But now that we're able to dive into Hendon Hooker, again, I spent a lot of time checking into his background, discovering how, number one, he ended up where he did, and ultimately how he ended up with the Lions and in his current situation. He originally wanted to go to Clemson. He was actually given an offer there, but according to a quote from his father, the offer made was non-committable. Now, I'm not exactly sure what non-committable means. And my impression on the situation is that Hendon Hooker and his family wanted to find a perfect situation for him as a quarterback, as a 4-star athlete, 3-star recruit. They felt Hendon Hooker was the quality quarterback that deserved to go to a Power 5 school. He did also have an offer from North Carolina A&T, like where his family went, but I think he saw himself in a bigger situation. I think his family saw himself in a bigger situation. But because they didn't commit to Clemson, they went ahead and signed another quarterback there. So Hendon had to move on. He then goes on an extensive recruiting tour, and that sort of becomes a theme for him and his family, is this kind of idea of not being able to commit and then ultimately losing out on an opportunity. So he has had a string of bad luck over his career. I think not only with Clemson, I think there was an offer from Notre Dame. I think there was another offer mixed in there as well. And I just think they weren't able to commit on the spot during the recruiting trail. They then leave the school. Ultimately, someone else comes there, commits on the spot, and he loses his opportunity at some of these big-time schools. He ultimately ends up signing with Virginia Tech and spending the 2018 through the 2020 season there. So let's go through that in some detail. So now this is where things get truly interesting for Hendon Hooker. Like I said, he originally was on the path to sign elsewhere. He stops at Virginia Tech, coming home from a recruiting tour elsewhere. Virginia Tech rolls out the red carpet for him at this point, apparently enough so to him and his family to where he ends up committing to Virginia Tech. So in 2018, he sees very limited time in a backup role. Ultimately, he does what he just wanted to do from the get-go, was redshirt his freshman year. That ends up happening in 2018. In 2019, although he expected to be handed a starting role, that was not gifted to him. That was handed over to Josh Jackson. Josh Jackson was then hurt. Rather than turning to Hendon Hooker, they went over to a quarterback named Ryan Willis. So he was actually third or fourth in line in the depth chart leaving that season. So Hendon decides to stick around and keep competing. He ultimately does take over the job in 2019 and does fairly well. He ended up actually passing for a school record. I think it was 124 consecutive passes without an interception. And like I said, did fairly well. He then enters the 2020 season with finally the starting job after spending a redshirt season and kind of battling through a few quarterbacks, finally seeing time. 2020 begins. Things are starting to look up. Well, unfortunately, we all know that's when COVID hit. And Hendon Hooker was one of the early cases of contracting COVID. That then put him behind the eight ball in 2020, and he didn't end up starting that particular year. So a quarterback by the name of Braxton Burmeister actually ends up starting the first 3 games of that 2020 season for Virginia Tech. Hendon then finally, according to the school and the coaches, becomes healthy enough to take over and did see some quality time there over the 2020 season. Over his career at Virginia Tech, he started 15 games. He had 2,894 pass yards with 22 touchdowns to 7 interceptions, and also added 1,033 rush yards and an additional 15 touchdowns on the ground. So pretty good numbers even in limited time there with Virginia Tech. So before we wrap up his career at Virginia Tech, we got to talk about that weird ending. For any Hooker fans, I think they know the story, and if anybody wants to comment down below if I miss any true details, this is what I've been able to gather. Coming off of the fact that he contracted COVID-19 early on in that process in 2020, he did end up with the heart abnormality that they looked into, which ended up not being a huge deal, but because it was so early on in the COVID-19 process, everything was sort of up in the air with that. Well, in a game against Clemson, a nationally televised game towards the end of the season, it was a cold night in Blacksburg, Virginia. And with the waffling that Virginia Tech had done at quarterback, they were sort of in between himself and Burmeister. And so they end up pulling Hendon Hooker off the field after a not-so-great series. They tell him over the radio that he's coming out for the next series in lieu of Burmeister. He goes out, I think either gets hurt or doesn't do well, so they're going to then want to bring Hooker back in. Unfortunately, he has the issue where he starts to kind of shake almost uncontrollably like he's shivering cold. It was caught on the cameras. Nobody was really sure what to make of it at that time. Obviously, the coaching staff on the Virginia Tech sideline didn't know what to make of it. They end up putting him back in the game while all this is going on. And he ends up fumbling. I think they run it or end up scoring a touchdown close after that. Again, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But all of that was sort of mishandled by the school, by the coaches. The whole thing was just miscommunicated. And I don't think anybody knew truly what was going on. I think eventually they find out through testing after the fact it was a magnesium deficiency. So they did end up kind of correcting that. But it was just a really weird way for Hendon Hooker to make his exit from Virginia Tech. That was his last game there in Blacksburg. He did end up completing his degree at the school, but ultimately ended up entering the transfer portal in December of 2020, as did many players from that Virginia Tech program at that time. And you start to question sort of what was going on with the coaching staff and the players' interpretation of what was happening at that time there in that program. So a very interesting way for him to end his tenure there at Virginia Tech. So kind of circling back to his original recruiting trail, because of the COVID-19 restrictions, they weren't really able to go visit all the schools if you enter the transfer portal at that time. And so Hendon had to kind of rely on folks that he'd met previously on other recruiting trips. Well, that leads him ultimately to the University of Tennessee. There were only a few Power 5 offers coming into the transfer portal for him at that point, one of them being Tennessee. And I think he was familiar with the current coaching staff at that time at Tennessee, again, from some previous recruiting trips. So he ends up committing to Tennessee on January 7th, 2021. But the head coach, Jeremy Pruitt, is then fired from the program with most of the rest of the coaching staff on January 18th, 2021. So Hendon makes this commitment based on people that were there who were then immediately let go, and it puts him in another tough situation. So Tennessee brings in the new guy, ends up being Josh Heupel, who was formerly the UCF head coach. He brings in another quarterback that he's familiar with, Joe Milton from Michigan, and Milton ends up winning the starting job at Tennessee. So whether you call it luck, whether you call it putting himself in a tough spot, not making the right commitment at the right time, Hendon Hooker is again the backup at a Power 5 program at the University of Tennessee. Now, the fortunate part, I guess unfortunate part for Joe Milton, is that a few games into the season, it wasn't playing well, ends up getting hurt week 2. So in enter Hendon Hooker, and he finishes out the 2021 season for the University of Tennessee. He ends up leading Tennessee to a 7-6 record in 2021. Had 2,945 passing yards, 31 touchdowns against only 3 interceptions. Those are pretty incredible numbers for missing a couple weeks at the beginning of the season. And like I said, he finally puts himself in a situation where I don't think Tennessee could do anything else. He's given the starting job as he enters 2022. They end up starting off 8-0, the Tennessee Volunteers, in 2022, one of the best seasons in their program's history. They ended up getting to number 1 in the college football playoff ranking in that first poll that they came out with. I don't think they reached number 1 in the AP poll. That belonged to Georgia, who they eventually lost to. But that's pretty incredible. It was a good season for the University of Tennessee, and Hendon Hooker held up his own. Through those first 8 weeks, he was the Heisman favorite. And if things didn't shake out the way that they shook out, he probably ends up winning the Heisman in 2022. Unfortunately, we know that Hendon Hooker suffered a non-contact torn ACL versus South Carolina, which ended up being in a loss. I think that was week 11. Ended up finishing 5th in the Heisman voting still, even after that injury. And in 2022, finished off with a very impressive stat line: 3,135 pass yards, 27 TDs to 2 interceptions, adding 430 rush yards and 5 TDs on the ground. He still ended up being first team All-SEC and won the 2022 Offensive Player of the Year for the conference. It was the most wins for the University of Tennessee since 2001. They finished with 11, which was the second most in the program's history. And like I said, I think he wins the Heisman if he doesn't get injured there in South Carolina. With all that being said, with the injury, he spent a lot of time in college at big-time programs and clearly established himself as a big-time athlete and a good quarterback. So he enters the 2023 NFL Draft with a lot of questions, but the Lions, through some finagling and moving in the draft, remember they ended up moving from 55 to 63, then back to 68. I think it was a trade with the Buffalo Bills or the Denver Broncos. This was in round 3, and they end up selecting Hendon Hooker at pick 68. Now remember, he started on IR. This was designated July 20th, 2023. Spent a majority of the season in 2023 on injured reserve. Was finally activated December 19th, 2023. Really only saw practice time, but ended up staying number 3 on the depth chart behind Teddy Bridgewater. And of course, the big money man, Jared Goff. Like we said as we entered the video, Jared Goff is the man. The Lions handed him a mega contract, and he has to be the reason why the Lions win a Super Bowl in 2024 or beyond. But that puts Hendon Hooker in a tough spot. We know the Lions took him in the 3rd round. Historically, you don't take a backup quarterback in round 3, a project guy, an injured guy that you have a lot of high upside with, but that's where we're at now. And as I've said in previous videos, I don't know if Hendon Hooker was the solution even before the Jared Goff contract. We don't know what we have. But ultimately, the Lions have a lot of options now to move forward, even with the current contract situation. And I'm going to present a few options to you now. Number one, they can look to trade him right away. If they really think there's some value to Hendon Hooker at this moment right now, and I've seen some articles and heard some whispers here and there that teams may be interested, they could make a move. My argument against that is I don't think he carries as much value as he may ultimately have in the future. So I would hold on to that and stay away from that option, number one. Number two, you just wait. You just wait. You have Jared Goff for the next 5 years with the 4-year extension. You have Hendon Hooker, which I think was originally a 4-year deal, so you have him for the next 3 at least. And you groom him as a backup quarterback. You see what you have in that talent, and you either just allow him to be the backup quarterback solely, and that's it. Or what I think truly happens is Ben Johnson, the creativity that he's already shown in his offensive scheme, you find ways to then work Hendon Hooker into that scheme. And I don't mean split time. I don't mean a 50-50. I don't mean a dual quarterback system. That does not work in the NFL, and I don't see them doing that. But could they bring him in a special package situation, goal line situation, 1 yard to go situations? I mean, the options are endless. And can Ben Johnson find creative ways to use him? I really believe that he can. And that, I think, is a very good option, too. Option 3 kind of ties into option 2, whereas if you do cultivate him as your backup quarterback, you show the value with him over the course of a couple preseasons and maybe getting some time in the backup role. Heaven forbid there is an injury to Jared Goff. Or even worse than that, Jared Goff just completely falls off, which I think is the last thing that happens here. I don't expect that whatsoever. So to me, it's more going back to if there's an injury and Hendon Hooker has to step in for a play, a series, a game, a few games to get them by for a season, to keep them in a playoff race. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And if you do that, he then continues to build this value. And that is where I get to option 3, is that if you build that value, then at the end of his contract, once you've shown what he can truly give, then teams will even be more interested to make a trade, to give you more in return for this guy. Option 4 is, again, tying into 2 and 3 a little bit. But instead of just making the trade, maybe he shows so much in this time that he's given to where you can't do anything else. You let Goff ride out his contract. You either pick up or don't that 5th year, and you say bye-bye Jared Goff, come on in Hendon Hooker. Now, a lot of things would have to happen both positively and negatively on both sides for that option to play out, but that is an option. And I think people have a tough time looking that far into the future. Ultimately, what I think is going to happen here is option 2. I think the Lions are going to continue to groom Hendon Hooker as the backup quarterback. They're going to just have to eat the fact that they took a guy in the 3rd round and be okay with maybe having one of the better, more athletic backup quarterbacks in the NFL. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And use him in those situations that we've discussed. Find creative ways to make it work for the offense, for the Lions, and really do whatever we can to win a Super Bowl. Support Jared Goff more than anything else. And that is the option that I see the Lions taking here as we enter 2024. So what do you guys think the Lions should do with Hendon Hooker? Were you a Hendon Hooker guy from the get-go? Should they have never signed Jared Goff and seen what they had in Hendon before they give this mega contract to, a guy who's been up and down in his career? You could certainly make that argument. Now, previous videos that I've made would argue against that, but believe me when I say this, I've had conversations with folks that believe that to be the case, so let me know how you feel. I love discussing it. In my opinion, I think the Lions are in a really good spot, even with the backup quarterback, Hendon Hooker. But let me know what you think. If you dug the video here today, make sure to hit the like button. It's a great free way to help out the channel. Hit the subscribe button and notify bell so you don't miss any future videos. We're going to have more player profiles as we get even closer to the 2024 season. We have a membership option now available, and I'm going to have very fun exclusive content, especially as we get closer and closer to the NFL season in 2024. Thank you guys for coming along for the ride. I appreciate all of your time. Thank you. I will see you very soon.